presenting an overview talk on the multi-year reanalysis of remotely sensed storms, otherwise known as mirrors. The mirrors project is a kind of foundation, or it's proposed as a foundational piece to enable the FACETS program. You may have heard Lance Rothfuse present the FACETS program idea for improving the services the Weather Service provides in short fuse warnings, convective warnings, and other areas. So mirrors is playing into that. So we thought we would invite Kyle and Travis for this session to sort of let us know what mirrors is all about. So Kyle and Travis, are you there?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, take it away.
All right, thank you. Well, pretty good introduction, so we'll just get going. Before we go too far, we just want to recognize a lot of the other folks we work with. Some of them, many of our students that have come through and helped us process the data. Some of our hydro colleagues here at NSSL, and then some of our colleagues out at NCDC who also were doing a bulk of the processing for the data set. So why are we doing mirrors? I think there was a good introduction there of, you know, trying to get data into facets, and Travis will talk about that after a while. But kind of three main purposes, the first being just a consistent radar data set across the CONUS. Since we'll be merging radar data, we don't have to worry about different, you know, geometry problems of the raw level 2 data that you run into with cones of silence and such. But also is to help research here at the lab out for probabilistic warnings or probabilistic information for warnings. And then, of course, with MRMS going operational, having a data set like this to draw on can help us develop new techniques and improve the products that are within MRMS for operations. So if you're not quite familiar with MRMS, it's a system that basically blends together neighboring radars onto a consistent kind of Cartesian lat-long grid, you know, over the CONUS is kind of how it will be set up. So I just have a quick example here of a storm that was very close to the Boston radar. So you can see in the top left, the Boston radar is kind of where the circle is on this line. And then obviously you can see the cone of silence. Just for an example, I bring in a nearby radar, this one from Long Island. You can see the cone of silence is filled in. We bring in other radars, typically it's the nearest 3, and then we blend it together. So you can see down in the bottom left what MRMS outputs as far as filling in that cone of silence that is there for Boston. And then also you can kind of see the more gridded appearance of the radar data. This is just one of the height levels within there. Then we can take that merged reflectivity data and combine it with NSC near storm environment information and output different severe weather indices. So for instance, what I have down here is our MRMS maximum hail size, or MESH, to give an idea of, you know, how large the hail is that's being produced by that storm. So for mirrors, essentially what we're doing is we're running the MRMS system, but on all of the archived level 2 radar data produced by the WSR-88Ds. We're outputting about every 5 minutes. It's being run on a 0.01 degree by 0.01 degree resolution horizontal grid. That's approximately 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer over the CONUS. And then it runs on 35 vertical levels. Nearer to the ground, it runs at a finer spacing. It's 250 meters. And then as we go up, it eventually expands to 1 kilometer. The finer spacing near the ground is mostly for our colleagues in dealing with QPE issues in hydrometeorology. So what have we done so far? Well, between NCDC and us here at NSSL, we've completed the years 2000 through 2011. 3 of the years still need to be QC'd, and I'll go into the QC issues later on. So this is about 105 million volume stands over that entire time period. We'll actually, when we can get started again, right now we're kind of in a QC and archiving phase. When we get started again, we'll start with more contemporary data, so 2012, 2013, before we process data that's even older, pre-2000. So how exactly do we do this processing? Well, we do it in a distributed framework, and the reason why we distribute it is it kind of allows us to conserve the I/O on the machines. The biggest bottleneck that MRMS runs into in all the processing is I/O, because a lot of files are being written out simultaneously. So how we do it is we have kind of a data store that holds all of our raw level 2 data and some process model grids so that we can run our mergers. Then we just kind of farm that out to all of our machines here at the lab, and we have about 20 different servers that kind of crunch on this data. So for any given day, the radars can go to any machine. But while we're doing that farming, we specify one machine to serve as our merger. So you can kind of see through the diagram, let's say red is one day. So the red may be spread amongst 3 machines, but once all the data is processed, it arrives at another one. And then on that one machine, we run our merger for the CONUS. And then once we're finished with that, we bring the processed MRMS grid back to our data store so that it can be farmed out again to do any projects that we happen to be working on, which mostly has been our QCing processes. So it cuts down on the I/O, and by kind of rolling through days like this, we maximize the computer resources we have available to us, as opposed to just putting one entire day on a machine and just letting it kind of tough through the data. When we distribute it out, we really maximize our resources. So so the main grid that gets produced is our 3D reflectivity grid, of merged 3D reflectivity grid. And then from there, you can, with the MRMS system, you can kind of derive whatever you like. We'll mostly be focused on the severe weather products. That's what Travis and I do here at the lab. But you could produce anything to deal with aviation. And then, like I said earlier, our hydro folks are already working on a QPE climatology for the CONUS. So just a little bit on our processing that the single radar goes through. The first major step that we do is we clean up the reflectivity data. That's done with the neural net that was developed here at NSSL. It also goes through some additional QC for biological scatterers. The reason why it's done like that is we're dealing with a lot of single pole data and not dual pole data. So we need to clean up for what would be further blooms around the radar, and that is so that's kind of done in one step. Then we de-alias velocity data, because we do merge some composite layers of azimuthal shear, so we need de-aliased velocity, and then we run the azimuthal shear calculations, and that's done with an algorithm that's within MRMS called linear least squares derivatives, or LSD. And then from LSD, that's run on each single radar, and then for each radar, a composite layer, 2 composite layers are produced of azimuthal shear, one for near the ground and another for the mid-levels. So a little bit about our QC issues that we go through. So kind of how we QC things is we look at our azimuthal shear grids and our mesh grids, because typically if anything's going wrong with the radar data, mesh will show it, and then of course with velocity, the only thing we have to look at is the azimuthal shear. So for instance, we accumulated the mesh for an entire day, and this is what came out. And you can see this white is essentially any mesh greater than 85 millimeters. This is mid-December. I don't think we're expecting large areas of 85 millimeter mesh in Arkansas. So obviously there's a problem here. So we go in and we dig around in the data to find out what happened. And basically what happened is essentially the radar had some sort of issue, or a test pattern got in or something like that. Here basically the radar's putting 95 plus dBz everywhere, and this happened at all tilts. So you can understand how we end up with giant mesh, essentially. So with this, we'll go in, we'll dig out the bad radar data and then reprocess. So it's actually kind of time consuming because we process the CONUS all at the same time. So if one radar is bad, you basically have to reprocess the entire day. And that can run anywhere between 8 and 12 hours of processing time. Another issue, just trying to highlight, you can kind of see this ring around the Duluth radar of higher mesh, obviously not a natural looking feature. Meanwhile, you can see other storms that look quite all right. So when we go in and look, this is a a problem that we can't really handle as well because it's just these little pixels out on the fringe of the radar range that are higher, and it's just noise that's within the data. But we don't necessarily want to throw out all this data since there is a storm going right over Duluth. So there is going to be some noise in the data set, and it's just, you just hope for law of large numbers to kind of minimize any of the problems that could happen from the noise. Finally, to kind of show an azimuthal shear problem, I don't think there was a giant supercell centered right on Lubbock on this day. So if we go in and have a look, obviously some issues with the radar. Again, we don't necessarily want to just throw out the Lubbock radar since there is reflectivity in the area, but you can obviously see that the velocity data needs to be topped out. So we're still kind of struggling with what to do exactly with any velocity problems of how to separate it out, from reflectivity issues. And then probably our most pervasive problem that happens year in and year out and for quite a few number of days is when we get radar ducting along the coast, and then you get a lot of noise along the coast, reflectivity-wise, from distant radars. So the merger thinks, oh, look, there's big reflectivities aloft, and so it puts in large areas of mesh. Still kind of fighting our way through this. Essentially, we're kind of removing the radar data if there's no other storms around, but it is another issue that we hit in the database.
Hey, Kyle, define mesh, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's our maximum expected hail size product. So it's a vertical integration of reflectivity above the melting layer to give you an idea of how big the algorithm thinks the hail is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So kind of the easiest low-hanging fruits as far as applied projects we can do with this is to do radar-based climatologies. So we're doing that with the mesh to get a radar-based hail climatology for the CONUS, and we're doing it with our azimuthal shear for radar-based kind of rotating storms. Not so much tornadoes, but rotating storm climatology, since rotating storms produce most of the severe weather. Anyways, I was hoping to have a little bit more, but we hit a little processing snafu. So we're still in the middle of this, but I can kind of give you an idea of how we'll produce these. So what you see pictured on right here is our raw mid-level shear product. You see there's a lot of noise. Near some of these tracks, you can see some nicer tracks in eastern Wyoming. There might be one near Riverton up here. And so first thing we do is we run this data through a multiple hypothesis tracking method to help clean it up. So basically we identify little clusters at each time step and then try to relate those clusters over time. Clusters that don't get related get tossed out. And so what you end up with is this middle image where you can kind of see the lower values have been cleaned out, and also we've kind of preserved just these more realistic looking tracks. We then put that through a number of smoothers to try to spread it out to get, we're going for climatology, so these three storms here could have occurred kind of anywhere in that area, and so then we smooth it out to get something like this image. And then what we can do is for all of those days is process it, or we can process it for the entire year. This was supposed to be a yearly accumulation. One of my students let me know this is not quite a year. Some data got left out of it, but this is the year 2000. On the left is kind of the raw accumulation of mid-level shear. And then once we run everything through our smoother, this is what we get on our right. So you can imagine we go through year in and year out. Everything will kind of fill in as storms happen. And then we can get an idea of, where rotating storms are the most common, where we can do the same exact process for the mesh field, so we can get an idea of where large hail is most frequent, and things like that. So I wish I had a little bit more there to show, but just hit a processing problem. So going forward, as far as processing, we're already planning for the next time around. We kind of anticipate we'll run this data generation 3 or 4 times to really get things right. But the big thing is we need to make smooth timing. Right now it's about approximately 5 minutes, but we can actually make it every 5 minutes on the dot, which will be a lot easier to do things like QPE and also stitching together data. We did find an issue with the corrected shear calculations within LOC. We are using corrected shear there, and we need to fix that. We need to produce an unQC'd composite reflectivity for the CONUS. That will be helpful for folks that want to use the data set for biological, like bird tracking. Also, it'll help us identify any major QC issues that exist within the data set a lot easier, and for users that end up using this data set, downstream. And then we have to identify any reflectivity issues that might be affecting the QPE estimates, and also the hail size estimates and things like that. So I'll turn it over to Travis here, and he'll kind of describe more of the towards operations things we'll do with the data set.
While we're transitioning, we got one question. What MHT is defined as?
It's multiple hypothesis tracking. Essentially, if you have multiple identifications, so let's say of storms, over time, it's a way of making sure that you relate every identification of those storms at each time step more correctly. But you can also use it to clean up the individual time steps for the gridded fields, because if something's just there and then it's gone, it most likely was noise.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. Okay, so Kyle gave a very good summary there. I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about how this relates to kind of our bigger picture plans with the FACETS project. And FACETS stands for Forecasting a Continuum of Environmental Threats. Steve mentioned that Lance Rothfuse is kind of leading that project to look at different ways, or a way of evolving the Weather Service warning paradigm in the future. And so there's 7 facets. I think he actually gave a talk on here a few months ago about it, but you can look that up. It's all over the place, I think, so pretty easy to find information. But just to go through a few things that we want to do with the data set in the near term and longer term. Kyle talked a little bit about the hail and specific azimuthal shear or mesocyclone scale tracks, but there's other things we can do with this as well. And one initial thing we want to do is start looking at identifying and classifying individual storm cells in the data set. So imagine having a 15-year climatology of how many supercells occurred versus bow echoes versus popcorn thunderstorms. What type of storms formed in different environments. And so the way we do this, we have a multi-scale storm cluster identification algorithm. And here's just an example of what storms may look like in reflectivity. And then areas that may be identified as storms based on some reflectivity at some level threshold. And then on a larger scale, the gray areas may actually be a larger scale cluster. We can combine these together. You can see that we've identified things at multiple scales. So the kind of multi-cell broken line thing there is the gray, and then the individual subclusters are picked out. And within those specific clusters, we've got all these different parameters that we calculate. And there's I'm not going to go through all of them here, but there's reflectivity-based ones, from the 3D reflectivity grid. There's the velocity derivatives, the azimuthal shear, and then there's several derived parameters as well as near-storm environment parameters like surface temperature and dew point and CAPE and stuff like that. So all this information for each one of those clusters, whether it's a larger scale cluster or a smaller scale cluster, are tracked for every cell that occurs over the entire data set. The folks at the Storm Prediction Center, specifically Brian Smith and Rich Thompson and some others there, have been looking at, they've developed a method for classifying storm mode, and they have a nice set of papers out of that. I've got one listed down there at the bottom, and we use sort of a variation on that with some different subcategories, and essentially what we can do is take our data set that we have with all those different variables, and I showed on the last slide, and we can use some artificial intelligence techniques to take the information that Brian and the gang at SPC have used to classify storms, and we can match up our automated detections with their manual expert forecaster classified storms, and essentially use their information to train a neural net or a decision tree or something like that. I think we're using a decision tree. I'll show you a little bit of that in a second. And for all the storms that they don't classify, we can try to pick out a storm type, and then we can also show how well that decision tree works. So here's an example of one of these. You don't have to look at all the details, but it starts up at the top with reflectivity, and it breaks it out on all these different categories using all these different trees. That we zoom in on this area here, you can see some of the different categories and how decisions were made. And again, this is just based on training, and this isn't fully trained. It's only been trained on about 8 days of data, and so we'll be retraining this in the future on a larger data set and validating on a larger data set. So this is kind of preliminary work that one of our graduate students, Tim Humphreys, did, and also a previous graduate student, Angela Nkoloji, or Hobson now. So anyway, once we get that, we can do a little bit of post-processing and looking at statistics, comparing this to what we know about ground truth, which is another whole talk in itself that Kyle can probably give. But if we have data over a large time period, then we can look at the distributions of how the storms performed, depending on their mode and depending on what environment they formed in. What probability, what's the likelihood that a storm, a supercell that forms in a high CAPE, low shear environment with high dew points or low dew points or whatever, will produce a tornado, severe wind, all these things. And so we can produce for each storm cluster the probability that an event is ongoing, that something is happening now, or the probability that an event will occur in the next 0 to 60 minutes or whatever. And we can generate a grid based on that, and we're calling that probabilistic hazard information. This is also part of the FASTEST project, and so this is just an example from some work that Chris Karsten has done here at the lab. It's not based on the mirrors data set, but this is based on some just probabilities that he hand generated, and so that essentially there's a storm location, or in this case I think it was a tornado location, and then downstream what were the probabilities along the path that the storm actually took there. I think the midpoint's not the validation. I think that's the future forecast track. But you can generate a probabilistic field for every individual grid point, and then you click on a grid point, and it'll pop up what your probabilities are there in the next 30 to 60 minutes. And in the future, we'll be blending that with Warn-On forecast, storm scale ensemble information, and other things to generate more informed probabilities. But that's a way of generating. We'll be essentially for facets, we'll be using this as a data set to make informed first guesses, help forecasters provide a first guess for what the probability of something will occur is. And that's sort of like storm scale moss in some ways, what Lance has been calling it. Other things we can do, I mentioned storm scale ensembles, warn on forecast. We can do some blending with that. It's going to take, each time an ensemble, storm scale ensemble for warn on forecast runs, they're targeting being able to run stuff every 20 minutes out to an hour or two. Well, at first, there is some latency there involved in generating the ensemble. So how do you fill that in? I think probably with the statistical database here is a good first guess. We can also use it for validation of storm mode in convection allowing models. We actually have a R2O proposal out about that. I think that'll be a very valuable use for the MIRRS data set. And then, if we're generating probabilities based on the storm scale statistics, warn on forecast project should be able to beat those in theory. That's a good test of how well those forecasts are doing. Of course, to accomplish this and make sure it's working well, we have to have high-resolution verification, and we can also develop some synthetic verification based on radar data and well-known algorithms or how they perform. We can quantify how they perform. I think Kyle has probably talked about SHAVE to this group before, and then the MPing project is a separate one that uses it's a phone app essentially for crowdsourced reports. And then we can also develop a relational database. This would be useful for the Storm Prediction Center and others of storm type and severity by environment based on the radar data and not just based on storm reports. And then Kyle mentioned that the QPE, this is work that Ken Howard and Jin Zon's group are doing at NSSL, collaborating with the folks at NCDC. So there's that work, and that's probably an entirely separate talk that can be had here. And so some other opportunities and plans. Kyle mentioned that we want to fix issues and rerun, and we'll probably rerun it a few times because every time we run it, we're going to find new issues, and people are going to develop new QC techniques that could be applied. Addition of dual pole data in the future, of course, would be very important, as well as being able to process this data. Right now, it's essentially a clone of the MRMS system, but MRMS system running real time could have radar dropouts or other communications issues. We want to be able to make sure we can reprocess things and ensure that we have all the data involved there, that not just the real-time data. We want to build a web front end for data mining and case studies by ourselves and for collaborators, people who want to collaborate with us on the project. There's lots of opportunities in aviation, insurance, climate research, and agriculture, and I think the list just goes on and on as far as what could be done with the data set. So brief summary, we're in the process. We've made really good progress, I think, on getting a lot of data processed, and have identified a lot of QC issues. Got kind of this post-processing and sciencey things to do next. And ask us in another year or two, we'll come back and probably have a lot more to talk about. QP radar retrospective is probably a different talk there, but I think there's really, really a lot of science opportunities, not just at the storm scale, but even getting up towards the climate scale. We don't really, 15 years isn't a lot in the climate world. So even if we have all the data processed, it doesn't make a giant dent in there, but we have had some climate folks who are really interested in the data set because it's such an improvement over things like storm data that have kind of their known limitations and issues with being tied to warning, the warning process. This is a little bit more objective. So anyway, I think that's all we have as far as the talk goes, but we'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Travis and Kyle. So if you have questions, please use the raise your hand feature, and John Chattel will unmute you so you can ask your question directly to Kyle and Travis, or use the chat function. John, do we have any yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, so while we wait, I've got a couple. So clarification question, and what's the lowest level and highest level in the in the data vertical levels?
Yeah, the first level is 250 meters, and then from 250 meters to 3 kilometers, it runs at 250 meter spacing. From 3 kilometers to 9 kilometers, it runs at 500 meter spacing, and then it's 1 kilometer after that to 20 kilometers. So 20 kilometers MSL is the highest, and 250 meters MSL is the lowest.
Okay, thank you. And so I think at the very end, Travis sort of touched on this. So I wanted to possibly get a clarification about the difference between this and the MRMS real-time system. So the MRMS real-time system, which came online within the last day or so, and hooray for that. That's been something that we've been tracking here at headquarters for a long time, and it's a great thing to see. But it has some, the MRMS has real-time QCing obviously being applied. So what's the difference between the QCing that, are you doing more on top of that, or just, is it completely separate from that QC?
Well, I think for the, at least on the severe weather, for the severe weather products, the QC is the same. For the hydro product, well, and I think for the hydro product, they're probably running the same QC as well. I can't answer exactly for the hydro folks, but they should. There's different levels of QC for severe weather products. We're probably more concerned with velocity issues as well as the reflectivity issues aloft that affect the hail products. For the QPE, they're more interested in sort of the low-level near-surface product, issues, and there's some overlap there, but there's also very specific differences that have to be handled. And so, for the MRMS real-time system, I'm fairly certain that all of the constraints and QC that are being applied are the same. Kyle, what do you think?
Yeah, just to clarify a little bit more, there is the base data QC, which is running the neural nets, and this Bloom QC, which cleans out non-meteorological, reflectivity. But what I was discussing here of all these QC issues, this is more of the bad data that happens to sneak through those processes. We're just trying to catch in that on the back end, and then reprocessing with cleaner data. So there is a data set quality control, but as far as the base reflectivity and velocity quality control, there's not really any big differences between operational MRMS and what's being done in mirrors.
Okay, great. So I have a question now on more on the science technical side. So obviously this is radar data, but like MRMS and mirrors yourself, I think there's multi-sensor implied. So in terms of like a holy grail data set for storm climatologies, you would want to have radar data and the associated cloud to ground and in-cloud lightning data and the associated geostationary satellite imagery and data. So are those in the plans for mirrors, or is this going to be mainly a radar and environmental, storm environment data set?
Right, yeah, you make a really good point there, and those are things that are in the plan to add. In fact, those are in the FACET's long-term plan to add those to mirrors. But we actually have access here to the CG lightning strike data for the equivalent time frame, and it's really with that just a matter of adding some additional processing on the back end to match it up with storms. And we have some actual lightning prediction algorithms and things like that here as well. The satellite data, we've talked with some folks and other folks in NOAA and in Wisconsin and places like that about how to bring that in, or possibly writing a proposal to bring that into mirrors here before too long. Now that we have the radar data pretty well on the way, I think it's time we start looking at that, because that will buy us a little bit of extra information, as far as storm top, cloud top temperatures, and for those storm cells that we're tracking. The Wisconsin folks have, and the folks at SPORT and other places have looked at convective initiation and things preceding the radar echo and early stage. And so I think there's definitely a natural fit there, and it might be able to tell us quite a bit more about things like convective initiation when you've got such a huge data set to do data mining on.
Right. But even in just the general tornado yes or no question, which weather service forecasters face in warning operations, there's always been this hope that if you could bring in some of these other data sets along with the radar, that you would get some independent information that could better discriminate between the tornadic, non-tornadic storms. But to this date, no one has really, aside for some case study type things, been able to tackle that and be able to come up with, reliable probabilities that could be applied. So this, to me, represents the best bet at the moment to do that if you can find a way to tackle it in a reasonable way, which is a big if, because you're already dealing with massive amounts of data just with the radar. So to bring in these other data sets is quite a challenge.
Right, yeah. Lots of pattern recognition and data mining expertise needed, it looks like, for this.
Yeah. I got one more just quickly. So the terminology you're using for seems like a really core concept for this is the storm cluster. And of course, we're familiar with storm clusters, but it's not, in terms of entities and literature, it strikes me of more like a meta terminology that really pertains to this analysis. So, but am I correct in that everything, if you're going to come up with probabilities, it's based on this storm cluster concept?
I mean, that's reasonable. I mean, we all know that storms aren't really objects. They're really processes, right? So, but for the purpose of the way the computer can interact with them, we have to identify them as objects, and so we're looking at objects with different scales, and then trying to pick out the features of the objects at those different scales. So we might identify, say a supercell, but maybe it's not an individual supercell. It may be embedded in a line, right? But it's got the characteristics of a supercell, rotation, and all those things, and even within that scale, even within that, we may pick out individual features of the supercell, like the mesocyclone, for instance, and track those. That's all kind of part of the ongoing research. But yeah, it kind of boils down to these objects, or these. It may not necessarily be exactly the storm cluster, because we may want to track mesocyclones, for instance. But that is one of the basic features of how we're doing things. It's not unlike the old sketch algorithm, but hopefully applied in a smarter way that that takes advantage of all the years of research and what we've learned about how to apply these identification and tracking techniques to storms over the years.
Okay, thank you, John. We have.
Steve Cope would like to ask a question about blending dual pol data.
Yeah, this is Steve. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, my question has to do with as you start to consider using the dual pol data, things like the mesh and QPE and other of these products will obviously be affected by the use of the improved data sets. Given the fact that dual pol was rolled out over a course of months rather than on one day of the year, how would you propose that you would blend what I would call pre-dual pol era radar data with post-dual pol radar data, and how it would, produce a nice blended data set in terms of providing time continuity and spatial continuity, given that there was a rollout that, went over a course of months?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, we can still use the reflectivity data and the dual pole presents an opportunity for better QC. So it's just take your opportunity for better quality control and use that data, as it is. But as far as I'm not quite sure how we would go beyond that. Because if it's only one radar that only has, certain capabilities and there's not other radars, I'm not quite sure how you would blend that together. But it is I mean, obviously it's something to have an idea as we continue down the road, developing here, new dual pole capabilities for hail sizing and such, of how we can take those and blend them with older techniques. We just haven't had a chance to really look at that.
Yeah, thank you. And that was really the gist of my question. I can imagine it being pretty complex as you're looking at historical data sets, and you want to have a product that has credibility over a long period of time. And it did take months to to bring the radar data out with the dual pole. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. I heard Travis to say that there's going to be opportunities in the future to go over this again and again and again with improved QC 1, 2, 3 in years beyond when I probably retire. Maybe it's going to go on forever. I don't know. And maybe it will. And that's okay because you're producing an improved product all the time. But there's this question of how you, even when you look at QC, Kyle, I think you're going to have to give a lot of consideration to that facet as well because, the QC itself will be dependent upon the nature of the data, and that will evolve with time.
Yeah.
Okay, John, we have another question.
Yes, Kevin Keller would like to talk. Next question.
Kevin Kelleher?
Yes.
Kevin, are you there?
Yeah, I don't think you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just wondering, and you might have mentioned this, I came in on slide 4, but when will the first complete run through the entire data set be done? And because I knew, early on there was a couple of starts and then recalibration and start again. Has one complete run been done? And if not, when do you expect it? And will it be available through NCDC, or how do you envision that?
I think we're still working that out a little bit. Right now the big thing is just these last 3 years for us to QC the data set, make sure there's no really noisy data in there. But as far as, and we've actually already done a data exchange with NCDC. We're just at a standstill right now while we're waiting for a new RAID to get installed, so we have someplace to actually put the data. But I think the first data release will probably be this 2000 through 2011 data. Timing on that, I'm not really clear. I don't have a picture of when we'll be done with the QC. Also, there's one more data exchange that needs to happen between NCDC and NSSL to make sure both parties have the entire data set.
Right. Yeah. So probably sometime in a few months, but we're and as far as the availability goes, we're some issues to be worked out there. But right now, the plan is for inside government access through NCDC, and then OU retains the right to license things, and so that might be a mechanism to distribute it to the private sector. We've had quite a few inquiries there as well.
Okay. Kevin, do you have a follow-up question?
So it's not going to be generally available to the public through NCDC, but only for internal government use?
There's some things to be worked out there, Kevin. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to play out at this point.
No, I understand. That's fine. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. John, do we have...
Sure. Tom Filiaggi has a question.
Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I know I see a lot of innovative and interesting ways that you guys approach these kinds of problems, and I like to see that. I also noticed that you mentioned an eye for performance, so you're trying to make sure that things are performing well enough. In the past, I know that some large data sets get tiled out into pieces, either for processing or for dissemination. And with this stuff, you showed that you have a single very large grid, covers CONUS. It sounds to me like that could still be a potential weakness when it comes to performance. Have you thought about, or do you have anything to say about how the processing might be improved performance-wise in regards to the domain? What reasons did you have for drop tiling and using one large grid, things like that?
So I guess I'll go first here. I'm trying to find, I can't find the slide. So there is an issue when you run this in tiles of discontinuities at the boundaries. And given the opportunity we had to reprocess the data, we didn't see any reason not to run it as one big grid. Now that's not to say that, Travis mentioned earlier we want to, make a web interface, for other folks to be able to come in here or come into the data set, and one part of that could be to crop out just certain parts of the domain. But the biggest reason we dropped the tiling was because of potential discontinuities you can have at the boundaries.
Yeah. You had mentioned that when you have a bad radar, you have to reprocess the whole thing. And that's what I was kind of wondering about. And the idea of using tiles, have you thought about using overlapping tiles so that you can get rid of those discontinuities?
You'll still have boundaries with discontinuities. So even if you try to overlap it, there's still some sort of boundary that will be there. Because we actually, for real-time processing, it makes sense to do the tiling because you're just not going to have the computer horsepower to get you there to do just one large domain. But on the reprocessing, it does take time, but that's just kind of built into the, the ebbs and flows of the processing anyways. So even if something goes wrong, I don't think it adds a, significant, adage of time onto our processing in general.
Yeah, the other thing with that is, given the amount of data that we're processing, it actually slows it down a little bit to do it on tiles, because let's say we were to cut the U.S. in half and 75 radars on one half, 75 on the other half. Well, there's actually a border along the middle there that requires you to process more than 75 radars for both halves. So along the, say if the eastern border and radars were perfectly distributed or whatever, you still need, to add 10 more radars so that you get matching data right along that seam, and that's part of what contributes to inconsistency as well, or the potential inconsistency. And so you have to process more radar data if you break it out into tiles.
One of your slides had multiple pieces of hardware as well, right?
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if using multiple pieces of hardware and overlapping tiles that you could save on processing as well as get rid of those boundaries.
Yeah. Well, for future processing, one strategy that we've talked about is, now we've got one pass to the data. If we're really only interested in storm days or tornado days or something like that, then we can pretty easily crop out just subsections of interest that need to be reprocessed, or for specific case studies and stuff, since we have all the data here now. And so those are some things that could be done too. But yeah, you're right. There's some ways it could probably be sped up in the future.
Okay, John, do we have another question?
Yes, Michael Magzig.
Mike Magzig, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, I was curious about the future. Sales just rolled out, so that's going to give us another minute or a couple minutes of a little bit more accuracy on exactly where things are that are of particular interest. So what is your plan for the, every time there's a new upgrade for the radar, there's always going to be something better coming. And so are you looking ahead to that to see, are you going to keep running this every year? Are you going to really focus on this first and then kind of catch up to that in later years, or what's the general plan for sales and the future upgrades?
Yeah, I think well, for sales specifically, the way the merger works, that doesn't really affect it because the merger just ingests whatever data is there. So you'll just have an update at lower levels near whatever radar happens to be running sales. But as far as any potential further upgrades on the radars, I think just given how long it kind of takes this data to process, so for all of these, it's taken, really from when we started to when we finished, it was a little over a year and a half. Most of this year has been dedicated to QC, so that puts us at about our 2-year mark. But for any other radar upgrades, I think it's just kind of, well, let's see where we're at when we're ready to go for our next go-around, and if we need to really incorporate anything new to the processing. But specifically for sales, it actually doesn't present a challenge. It's just more data gets in there.
Yeah, I was just thinking that when we go to run things, the next year it'll be, oh, well, this will probably be better this year than it was in this 10-year data set because we're doing something. So, we'll be interested and find out, well, how's that going to behave? And then if you're doing this aggressively, when each year kind of goes by, then it kind of starts to connect these things. If you're going to leave it for later, then there'll be kind of a gap. And so it sounds like you're just going to kind of evaluate it and decide whether to when to pull the trigger on post 2011 years.
Yeah. Yep, that's kind of the plan there.
And on your data that you were considering providing, are you primarily thinking the output data or the 3D reflectivity grid? Because it seems like a lot of that stuff can get derived from that 3D reflectivity grid, right?
Yeah, everything is any derivative product comes from the 3D reflectivity grid, and maybe some combination of some environmental data. But like Travis said, I think internally for NOAA, the whole data set is kind of there for use. It's really of the licensing issues with OU on what would be provided beyond the 3D grid.
Okay, John, do we have?
Nope, that's the last question at this point.
Okay, this is Steve Smith again. I wanted to ask Kyle and Travis about the use of mirrors as a proxy for severe weather. Basically, in terms of this is an aspect of facets which has been proposed that it's problematic to use the existing storm data set to verify our warnings, and it would be very advantageous to be able to use sort of a radar proxy for that. So how could mirrors assist in that effort?
So, sorry, excuse me. So the way it wouldn't be just mirrors alone that does that. Obviously, we'd want to use the mirrors data because it's at least all-encompassing. But one way you could do it, and I have it here on the screen right now, is if you combine, let's say, mirrors, hail size data with data from our severe hazards analysis and verification experiment, or SHAVE. For those not familiar with SHAVE, real quickly, basically since 2006, here in Norman, we get a group of students together, and throughout the summer, they call behind storms that look to have produced hail. We make verification calls at very high resolution, typically about 1 mile spacing, and we collect all sizes, even all the way down to no hail. So what we can do with that data is go in and kind of evaluate, let's say, different mesh thresholds to determine which mesh threshold works the best at delineating, let's say, severe versus non-severe hail, or at delineating significant severe hail as opposed to smaller sizes than that. And as you can see, Travis put up our stats. We have about 45,000 hail reports we could play around with right now. So we have a really big data set there, and I am in the process of using this data to kind of move this part of the project along. So the idea would be to take enhanced, ground verification data sets, combine them with the radar to then produce some guidance of using these grids as actual verification. We do a lot of things around here in high res. We're really involved with the the tornado damage surveys around Norman. The May 20th survey was done in incredibly high resolution. We essentially surveyed every single home for that tornado, which led to about I think it was 2,500 structures. So we can take things like that and compare them to our gridded products to then try to say, okay, if you use these gridded products as verification, here's the threshold you want to use. Or we can take the gridded products and maybe come up with some combination of them to then come up with synthetic verification.
Yeah, so the other thing there is, we know what the performance of the algorithms. We know they're not always perfect, but we can quantify what their performance is. And so, there's going to be there's already a large measure of uncertainty involved in verification, especially if you look at storm data. But, here we can actually quantify what those uncertainties are. And so, Kyle addressed a couple of things. The other thing I would say is that the big unknown for us at this point is wind. And we do have a graduate student who started to work on that problem. Actually, the other data set that we've not mentioned here that we're pulling in to start to look at is the MATIS data set, the archive there that goes back to the early 2000s or so with various mesonettes and so things like that where we can pull out specific wind gust reports and match them up with storm clusters and maybe we can develop something that's a little bit smarter where we can create a synthetic wind verification field that's really a probability that a wind gust exceeding a certain threshold occurred, and instead of just being confined to cities and stuff where we have mesonettes, that would be CONUS-wide. So
has the
very challenging, but
so has the MRMS rotation track shown at all usefulness regard for tornadoes?
Well, the thing about the rotation tracks is not really measuring at the scale of tornadoes. It's more measuring the mesocyclone scale, and so it's been used extensively to help with tornado damage surveys in quite a few different forecast offices around the country as a first guess of where to look. But at the moment, it is not a specific tornado detection algorithm. We are working on and have prototyped a couple of different tornado debris signature algorithms that are dual pole that bring in the same components as the rotation tracks algorithm does, but add on that layer of dual pole information to let us plot tracks based on that, at least close to radars.
Okay, very good. All right, well, we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to have to wrap it up. I want to thank Kyle and Travis for an excellent overview. This is really a lot to chew on, and I think having everybody be exposed to it is really important, and I encourage everyone to contact them offline for follow-up questions. I want to remind everyone we got 2 more VLab forums coming up before the end of the calendar year. November 19th is Chris Lancy from the Hurricane Center is going to provide us a talk on the Joint Hurricane Testbed. And on December 17th, I believe Tim Schneider from GSD and Boulder will be giving us a talk on the High Impact Weather Prediction Project, which is a new OAR project focused on weather service operations as well. So I want to encourage everyone to put that on your calendar. John Chattel will send you out the invite. You can put it directly on your Google Calendar. And we will see you all in November. So thanks. The recording of this will be uploaded to the website within the next hour or so. So if you want to check it out or share that with your colleagues, you'll be able to do that in about an hour or so. Thanks, everyone.